Did we just witness the blow-off top of globalization? The world's changing fast right before our eyes, leaving many wondering what's happening and, more importantly, what comes next. This is something that we haven't seen in our lifetimes before because it happens on a massive 250-year cycle. And so no one has ever lived to see this. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening. So in this video, I will break down what a blow-off top is, how they work, and apply this financial modeling to the greater world around us. While many people assume a blow-off top is only related to financial markets, I'm going to show you how we can use this framework to get a better understanding. And I think you're going to understand with more clarity what's going on in the world today, and more importantly, what we should be doing to navigate all of this. So let's go. All right, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss, and I make these videos to change the way you think about money because almost everything you've learned is wrong. And I'm gonna show you how to take some of these financial models that we've learned, or maybe you might have learned about money, and we'll apply them to the greater world overall. And so we'll start with the concept of a blow-off top. Now you might be asking yourself, what the heck a blow-off top is, right? Okay, so quickly, a blow-off top is when a market goes up really, really fast, like almost going straight up. We call it like a hockey stick. It goes into a parabolic run-up, and then it comes crashing back down. Now, when you're looking at it on a chart, you can see a graphical representation of what a true mania looks like. Now, there's been many manias, many blow-off tops in financial markets, and they all follow a similar pattern. There's the famous tulip mania of 1636. That's maybe the first one that really started it all. We had the dot-com bubble in 2000. We had the Bitcoin blow-off top. That was in December of 2017. Now, of course, there's way more of them to go through, but they all have the same characteristics in common. They go almost straight up, and it starts sucking in more and more people, which makes it go up even further and faster, sucking in more people. Now, of course, all markets stop going up when there's no more buyers. And so as they're going up, they start running out of new participants, and things get very volatile at the top. They start going up and down fast, and then the blow-off top happens. It's the crash. Now, if we look at the top of the rally, the markets that the people are experiencing, they're experiencing euphoria. And the reason for buying the stock or chasing the trend becomes less rooted in reality. Now, these people have very little understanding of the fundamental reason that they're buying the stock, and they're simply just chasing the positive price performance and the mania. Humans were emotional. We want to chase pleasure, and they're chasing that pleasure. But these people that come in at the top, they're the weak hands, and they sell as soon as the trend reverses. Now, we're going to be coming back to this cheat sheet throughout the video, so just keep that fresh in your mind for a minute. But let's apply this framework to other aspects of our civilization, because I believe we're watching a parabolic rise of centralization and socialism all around the world today in the 21st century. Now, today we're looking at a 250-year mania in centralization and globalization, which is not entirely a financial markets mania, it's also a social and a political mania. And just like the financial markets and asset bubbles that lead to blow-off tops, we're now witnessing the blow-off top of globalism and centralization. Now, we can see the signs all around us. Even Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, has announced that the Russian and Ukraine war has, quote, ended globalism. So what does this mean? Well, I believe we're at peak centralization or peak globalization, whatever you want to call it. Now, in regards to countries, we can see we've become way too reliant on the global just-in-time supply chain. And it became painfully obvious during the pandemic in 2020 when the United States couldn't even get PPE equipment because we've outsourced all of our manufacturing ability to China. And this really helped highlight the national security issue and the downsides to our highly globalized world. More recently, we can also see countries refusing to export food as fears of food shortages have spread all around the world. We can also see this peak centralization on the individual level too. People have outsourced every aspect of their lives to the government, whether it be their education, their healthcare, finances, their banking. Nearly every aspect of our everyday lives have been outsourced to the arms of the state. When looking at the signs of peak centralization, it's pretty easy to see it's all around us. We have the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the IMF, the UN. We have so many NGOs or non-government organizations. And just stop and think about it. Why does a global NGO like the IMF have the power to bully a small sovereign nation like El Salvador? Now, countries aren't even allowed to freely opt out of the centralized legacy financial system. Now, another NGO attempting to control the world is the World Mediological Association. Most of you probably haven't heard of that one before. The WMO is part of the United Nations, and they're specifically focused on implementing policies to combat climate change. The WMO are major contributors to the Paris Accord and, quote, warmly welcomed the U.S. back into the Paris Accord when Biden recently signed an executive order for the United States to rejoin the Paris Accord back in 2021. As a matter of fact, it was the very most important thing he had to do on the very first day in office. Now, we also have another NGO like the WHO, the World Health Organization. Now, this time they're trying to dictate health policies upon individual sovereign nations. Just recently, the WHO started calling for a global new World War II style treaty. In this new World War II style treaty, we're supposed to now abandon our country's individual nationalism and adopt the WHO's Constitution. I mean, what's wrong with the Constitution of the United States? I, for one, think it's pretty good, of course, if it was going to be followed. Another one of our favorite NGOs is the WEF, the World Economic Forum, who I've talked about many times on this video, and they are hell-bent on implementing their Great Reset agenda. And in the words of their own CEO, Klaus Schwab, they're also infiltrating the cabinets of governments all around the world. If there's one chart that represents what peak centralization is, it's this one right here. Now, we did an entire video exposing how these NGOs like the World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, the IMF, how they're able to achieve this only last week. Editor, go ahead and throw the link up right here so you can watch that video. All right. Now, we've started very zoomed out and taken a look at these NGOs around the world. But now let's take a look at the government bubble, all right, the growth of the parabolic run, so to speak. Now, since the American Revolution in the 1770s, we've been trending further from freedom, decentralization, and more towards centralization or globalization, right? Now, there's been many consequential events in the US, especially in the last century, that have pushed us further and further towards peak centralization, where we find ourselves today. Now, the first being FDR's New Deal back in 1933. In his infamous first 100 days, as it was called, he passed all types of programs giving massive power to the government, including the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which brought us the FDIC, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, Homeowners Loan Act, Glass-Steagall Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act, National Industrial Recovery Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, and a lot more. I'm not going to take the time to read them. Now, these bills fundamentally transformed the role of the federal government. Before the New Deal, the federal government was relatively small and mostly uninvolved with social and economic engineering. However, FDR's New Deal shattered the traditional role of the federal government by increasing its size and scope under the notion that only the federal government, in a massive intervention, would be the ones that could solve the Great Depression. Now, Roosevelt believed economic recovery depended upon cooperation at the expense of competition. And consequently, the NIRA was specifically designed to limit competition and enable industries to become monopolies. Seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Now, another notable law implemented in the New Deal was the Social Security safety net, which we still have here today, 100 years later, and has absolutely exploded since the 1990s. As the government continued to grow, they of course passed more rules, more regulations, more laws onto us, us the people. In fact, the pages in the Federal Register that list all these rules and regulations have grown by more than 300% in the last 50 years alone, since 1971. And the government just continues to suck in more and more of the economy like all blow-off tops do. Of course, the governments can't continue to grow at these rates from just the tax revenues they extract from us. And so, of course, the government debt has continued to pile up so they can pay for all of this. In fact, the debt as a percentage of GDP, of gross domestic product, has risen from 25% in 1980 to over 80% today in 2022. We can also see that as the government's power grab continues, the amount of people working for the government blew up from the 1950s through the 1980s. And while the government has continued to grow at a rapid rate, they've also taken over huge sections of the economy, in some cases, almost all of it, like education. Now, right now, total student loan debt in the United States now stands at a whopping $1.8 trillion. And that's up from just $1.1 trillion only 4 years ago. And the federal government owns 92% of that debt, making it the U.S. government's biggest financial asset. Now, as a side note, I'm not sure how the government's going to just forgive this debt and just wipe out their largest financial asset, but that's a whole nother topic. Let me know if you want me to do a video on that. We'll talk about that. But it's not just college debt that the federal government's taken over. They've also taken over education for elementary and high school students as well. They've done this through implementing something called Common Core. In 2010, the federal government implemented the program that dictates what K through 12 students learn throughout the United States. Now, schooling and education was always, in my opinion, should always be decided on a local level. But the federal government, they took it all over. And how do they do this? Well, how do they do most things? They do them with bribes. The federal government gave out $4.3 billion in grants to entice states to adopt this one-shoe-fits-all educational standard. Now, this standard has been adopted by over 40 states in the United States as students are indoctrinated with exactly what the government wants them to think. Another huge section of the economy the federal government took over, maybe the largest section, was healthcare. In 2010, the U.S. federal government took over the entire healthcare industry through something called Obamacare. Remember that? The federal government took over the healthcare industry. At the time, it was 17.2% of GDP, and they did it with one fell swoop. The government took over almost 20% of the economy, just like that. Now, another thing that's been either handed or taken over by the federal government is the People's Savings and Retirement. Now, we already talked about Social Security, but also in 1974, there was the passage of ERISA. The government passed another federal law that set minimum standards for retirement and health plans in private industries. And the U.S. government's currently on the hook for more than $200 trillion. Let me say that again. $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities that it owes to its citizens. So you can see that the government has continued to grow, and not just grow, but actually growing at a parabolic rate, just like a blow-off top. And of course, the larger the government grows, it also restricts our freedoms as well as extracts value from the economy, taking away from the productive and giving it to the unproductive. Now, most people today don't even realize that they're giving more and more power to the governments. It's just, it's the way things are supposed to go, right? It's this recency bias that leaves people tremendously unprepared for the coming swing back towards decentralization. Now, if you're new to following me and you haven't come across my 3-part video series on the 3 converging cycles, economic, political, and technological cycles, then you can go ahead and watch this series right here. Editor, go ahead and link that up right here. Now, the super high level of all that, as much things change, they also stay the same. About every 84 years, we hit a regime change or a populist uprising cycle. About 84 years ago was the end of World War II, where we saw Hitler, Mussolini, and of course, in the United States, FDR's New Deal we just talked about. 84 years before that, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, which led to the largest revolution in European history. And as a quick side note, I just rewrote that book, and it's called the Uncommunist Manifesto. You can check it out at uncommunist.com. I'm going to put a link to the description, or in the description in the video down below, so check out that book. But then after 3 84-year cycles comes the big one. 3 times 84 equals 252. And 250 years ago was the American French Revolution. 250 years before that was the Protestant Reformation. Without going deep into these, because like I said, I've done a bunch of videos on these before, each one of these represent the end of centralization and moving back towards decentralization. It's like a pendulum. It swings back and forth every 250 years. Now, this trend of outsourcing responsibility only goes on for so long until the individual wakes up and they realize the government's doing more harm than it's doing good. However, people are now beginning to realize the consequences of this today. A quote from a great book that talks about how the world changes is one of my favorites. It's called The Sovereign Individual, and it really illustrates where we are today. A quote from it says that the costs of supporting institutionalized religion at the end of the 15th century had reached a historic extreme, much as the costs of supporting governments have reached a senile extreme today. Now, if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. But either way, people are waking up. They're protesting against governments all around the world. Even residents in Shanghai, China are protesting against the government. Now, the most obedient citizens around the world are pushing back against centralization and top-down control. Shanghai is a city of 26 million people, and they've suffered from the strictest lockdowns since late March of 2022. Now, let's take a look at this video showing the Chinese citizens pushing back against the CCP's lockdown.
Ultimately, people took to the streets to protest. Residents of the many communities in Shanghai's Pudong New area reportedly broke through the blockade at 1 p.m. on April 14th and gathered to protest at Xiangnan Road, Zhangjiang Town, Pudong New area. The footage shows large crowds at the location while some people shouted, "Down with the Communist Party." Shortly after that, a number of armed police officers dressed in protective clothing came to the location to drive out the crowd.
All right, that's scary stuff, isn't it? Now let's hope this is a warning to everyone and not a playbook to follow, all right? But it's not only China currently protesting in the streets and pushing back against globalization. There have already been 13 protests break out all across the world just since the start of 2022. The most famous of those being the Canadian trucker protest. Now, another one of the most obvious pushbacks against globalization was done by Vladimir Putin. Putin famously ignored the international laws and treaties that NATO and the West wanted and invaded a sovereign nation. Now, what happens when these protests continue to proliferate? It's just like the asset bubbles. It sucked almost everyone in, and then things get very volatile at the top. And I think you would all agree that the world is pretty volatile right now, wouldn't you? It's important to remember that most of the people who have jumped onto the bandwagon of socialism are what we call weak-handed socialists, meaning that they're just going along with the trend. The reality is most people are just trend chasers. Humans are very tribal. We're pack animals by nature, and the majority of us like to follow what our peers are doing. Now, the interesting part of the blow off top is how rapidly the trend changes. The people who are sucked into the trend of centralization aren't convicted in their views, and so once people start abandoning this trend towards centralization, things can change very quickly. I mean, just look around you today. Since 2020, things are moving fast. Trust is being lost in the leaders, the experts, and the centralized institutions all around us at a rapid rate. Society is abandoning mainstream corporate media like CNN and seeking alternatives like podcasts and these YouTube videos. Now, it's these moves away from globalization that will have significant implications upon the individual's freedom and major economic impacts. We've also recently witnessed a country with nuclear weapons have their $600 billion in reserves frozen, seized, which of course just put the world on notice that their money isn't safe, and is showing you and me and the rest of the world that globalization is breaking down. Now, I've been talking about this for a while, and so of course, it's pretty common that people ask me quite frequently, when will the blow off top happen? My answer is, well, it's happening. We're watching this right now. As I've been saying, the pendulum is maxing out on the centralization side, and it's just starting to swing back towards decentralization. But what do you guys think? Can you see that it's happening right now? Do you agree we're living through extraordinary times, or am I dead wrong on this one? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. And if you don't like the video, that's okay. Give me a thumbs down, but at least leave me a comment and let me know why. And that's what I got for you today. All right, to your success. I'm out.